Hi everyone, welcome back. We've got a brand new story to share with you, so let's begin. My name is Bradley, and I'm 42 years old. For the longest time, I thought I had everything figured out. I had a wife I'd been married to for 15 years, a decent job that paid the bills, and 3 kids who meant the world to me. Laurie, my oldest, was 14 at the time this all happened. She was smart, maybe too smart for her own good sometimes, always asking questions and challenging everything. Then there was Dennis, who was 11. And finally, there was Brittany, my baby girl, who was only 6 years old. Sure, things weren't perfect, but whose life ever is? I figured we were going through a rough patch, the kind that every married couple faces at some point. The truth is, my marriage had been falling apart for years before everything exploded. My wife and I argued constantly about everything. It started small, like disagreements about how to discipline the kids or whose turn it was to pick up groceries. But it grew into bigger fights about life, about our future, about whether we were even happy anymore. I can't pinpoint precisely when things went cold between us, but it happened gradually after Brittany was born. The romance just faded. We stopped going on dates. We stopped talking about anything that wasn't related to the kids or bills. We became roommates who happened to share a bed, and even that became rare. I knew things weren't great, but I told myself we'd get through it. I thought maybe once the kids got older and life calmed down a bit, we'd find our way back to each other. Looking back now, I realize how naive that was. Instead of dealing with the problems at home, I did what many men do when things get uncomfortable. I buried myself in work. I took on extra projects, stayed late at the office, and volunteered to go on business trips I didn't really need to. It was easier to focus on spreadsheets and client meetings than to come home and face the cold silence or another argument about something I couldn't fix. I convinced myself I was doing the right thing, that I was providing for my family and giving them a good life. I knew my absence was making things worse, but I didn't know how to stop the cycle. Every time I tried to talk to her about it, we'd end up fighting, so eventually I just stopped trying. If I kept my head down and worked hard, things could get better on their own. Despite everything, despite the arguments and the coldness and the distance, I never once thought my wife would cheat on me. That possibility never even crossed my mind. We were both committed to making it work, or at least to keeping things together for the sake of the kids. We weren't affectionate anymore, sure, but we were civil. We showed up to parent-teacher conferences together. We had family dinners most nights, even if the conversation was strained. I believed that meant something. I thought she understood that I was essential to the family, that even if I wasn't perfect, I was trying my best. I assumed we were on the same page about keeping our family intact, even if our marriage wasn't what it used to be. I was wrong about all of it. Everything came crashing down on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. I'd been feeling terrible all morning at work, running a fever and dealing with body aches that made it hard to concentrate. By lunchtime, I knew I needed to go home and sleep it off. I didn't text my wife to let her know I was coming home early, because I didn't see any reason to. The kids were all at school, so I figured I'd have the house to myself to rest. I just wanted to take some medicine, crawl into bed, and sleep until I felt human again. I had no idea what I was about to walk into. When I pulled into the driveway, the first thing I noticed was a car I didn't recognize parked right in front of the garage. It was a black sedan, nothing fancy, but definitely not a car that belonged to any of our friends or family members. A weird feeling settled in my stomach, but I tried to brush it off. I grabbed my briefcase from the passenger seat and walked up to the front door, my head pounding from the fever. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, and immediately I knew something was wrong. There were clothes scattered across the living room floor. A man's jacket was draped over the back of the couch. A pair of shoes I didn't recognize kicked off near the stairs. My brain tried to make sense of what I was seeing, tried to come up with some innocent explanation, but my gut already knew the truth. As I stood there, I could hear faint sounds of laughter coming from upstairs. I walked to the stairs and started climbing, each step feeling heavier than the last. Part of me still hoped I was wrong, that there was some other explanation for what was happening, but deep down, I already knew. I reached the top of the stairs and walked down the hallway to our bedroom. The door was slightly open. I could hear them clearly now. I pushed the door open, and there they were. My wife, the woman I'd spent 15 years of my life with, the mother of my children, was in our bed with another man. They were tangled up in the sheets, and for a split second, neither of them noticed me standing there. Then my wife looked up and saw me. Her face went white. She screamed and scrambled to pull the blanket up to cover herself. The man, some younger guy I'd never seen before in my life, looked absolutely horrified. His eyes went wide, and he started stammering something, but I couldn't hear him. I just stood there in the doorway and couldn't move. My wife was crying now, saying my name over and over, but nothing felt real. The man was trying to get out of the bed, fumbling for his clothes, muttering apologies that meant absolutely nothing to me. I remember thinking how pathetic he looked, how miserable they both looked, but mostly I just felt numb. The shock was so overwhelming that I couldn't even feel angry yet. That would come later. In that moment, I just felt empty. I don't know how long I stood there staring at them. It could have been seconds or minutes. Time didn't make sense anymore. Eventually, something inside me snapped, and I turned around and walked out of the room. My wife was calling after me, her voice desperate and pleading, but I didn't stop. I couldn't be in that house for another second. I walked down the stairs, grabbed my keys from where I'd dropped them by the door, and left. I didn't say a single word to either of them. What was there to say? I got in my car and just started driving. I didn't have a destination in mind. I just needed to get away, to put distance between myself and what I'd just seen. At some point, I realized I was crying, tears streaming down my face while I drove aimlessly through town. I ended up at a hotel on the outskirts of the city. I walked into the lobby and checked in. The woman at the front desk asked if I was okay, probably because I looked like I'd just been hit by a truck, but I just nodded and took the room key. I rode the elevator up to the 3rd floor, found my room, and locked the door behind me. Then I sat down on the edge of the bed. My phone was buzzing constantly in my pocket, call after call from my wife, but I couldn't bring myself to answer it. I didn't want to hear her voice. I didn't want to listen to her excuses, her apologies, or whatever she thought she could say to make this better. I sat there in that hotel room, trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do next. Later that night at the hotel, my wife switched from calling me back to sending text messages. At first, they were apologies. She said she was sorry, that she never meant to hurt me, that it was a mistake. But when I didn't respond, the tone shifted. She started blaming me, saying that I had pushed her into someone else's arms. I read every single message, but I still didn't reply to any of them. I couldn't. I didn't know what to say, and honestly, I didn't trust myself not to say something I'd regret, so I let everything be. The next morning, I woke up with a pounding headache and a decision already made. I wasn't going to try to fix this. I wasn't going to pretend like what I saw didn't happen. I called a divorce attorney as soon as their office opened and explained the situation. The receptionist squeezed me in for an emergency consultation that afternoon. When I met with the lawyer, she listened to my story without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and told me that infidelity cases could get complicated, especially with kids involved, but that I had grounds for divorce and we needed to move quickly. She told me to start documenting everything, to keep records of all communication with my wife, and to avoid doing anything that could be used against me later. I left her office feeling as if I had at least taken one step forward, even though everything else felt like it was crumbling. 2 days later, my wife texted me begging to meet in person. She said we needed to talk about the kids and figure out what we were going to do. I didn't want to see her, but I knew we had to have this conversation eventually. I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop near our house, somewhere public, where I wouldn't lose my temper. She walked in, sat down across from me, and immediately started talking. She said the affair had only been going on for a few months, that it wasn't serious, that she never planned for it to happen. She confessed that she told her lover that they were separated because she was lonely and not happy. I just sat there listening to her. It wasn't just that she had cheated on me. She had built an entire alternate reality to justify what she was doing, and somehow she expected me to understand. When she finished talking, she looked at me like she was waiting for me to say it was okay, that we could move past this. Instead, I told her I wanted a divorce. I said I was filing on the grounds of infidelity and that I had already spoken to a lawyer. She started crying immediately, reaching across the table to grab my hand. She begged me to reconsider, said we could go to therapy, that we could fix this if we just tried. I pulled my hand away and told her there was nothing to fix. I told her I would be moving my things out of the house and that I'd be staying somewhere else until we figured out custody and who was living where. Instantly, she sat back in her chair and glared at me, her voice rising as she accused me of abandoning our family. She called me a coward, said I was running away instead of fighting for our marriage. She said the kids needed both of us, and that I was being selfish by giving up so easily. I didn't argue with her. I just stood up, left a $10 bill on the table for my untouched coffee, and walked out. I could hear her calling after me, but I didn't turn around. I got in my car and drove back to the hotel. Over the next few days, I focused on practical things because that was all I could handle. I started looking for an apartment near the kids' schools so I could still be part of their daily lives. Weeks later, I found a decent 2-bedroom place about 15 minutes away and signed the lease. The divorce proceedings started, and right out of the gate, my wife's lawyer came at me hard. She filed for primary custody of all 3 kids, and her legal team put together a case that made me look like the worst father in the world. They submitted evidence of my work schedule, showing all the late nights and business trips I had taken over the years. They pinpointed situations in which I had to cancel plans with the kids due to work emergencies. They even had a list of school events and family dinners I had missed. When I saw all of it laid out like that, it hit me how much I had been working. But the thing is, I was working to provide for them. I was trying to give my family a good life, a comfortable home, vacations, and college funds. Now all of that was being twisted into proof that I didn't care about my kids. It felt like a punch to the gut. The worst part of everything, worse than the betrayal and the legal battles and the sleepless nights, was watching what this was doing to my kids. Laurie, my 14-year-old, had always been intelligent and aware of things most kids her age didn't notice. She had not been home the day I found out about the affair. She didn't see anything, but she figured out what happened pretty quickly. When I finally sat down with her to explain that her mum and I were getting divorced, she didn't cry. She just looked at me with this complex expression and said she already knew. Then she told me she was angry with her mum and that she felt betrayed, too. For weeks after that, Laurie refused to talk to her mother. She'd spend every possible moment at my apartment. One night when I came to check on them, she broke down crying and told me that her mom had destroyed our family for something selfish and stupid, and that she didn't know if she could ever forgive her. I tried to tell her not to shut her mother out completely, that people make mistakes, but honestly, I understood her anger because I felt the exact same way. Dennis, my 11-year-old son, handled things differently. He didn't fully understand what had happened between his mom and me, but he knew things were bad. He knew we didn't live together anymore, that we barely spoke to each other, and that everything had changed. That confusion and stress started coming out in his behavior. He got into fights at school, something he had never done before. He talked back to his teachers and stopped turning in his homework. About 2 months into the separation, I got a call from the school counselor asking both my wife and me to come in for a meeting. We sat in that small office, as far apart from each other as possible, while the counselor explained that Dennis was showing signs of severe anxiety and anger issues. She recommended therapy and said we needed to create a more stable environment for him. My wife blamed me, saying this was happening because I had left. I didn't say anything back because I didn't want to fight in front of the counselor, but inside, I was furious. She had caused this, not me. Brittany, my youngest at 6 years old, was the most heartbreaking to watch. She didn't understand what was happening. She kept asking me when I was coming home, why Mommy was always sad, and if we were still a family. Every time she asked, it felt like someone was squeezing my heart. I tried to explain it in a way a 6-year-old could understand, telling her that Mommy and Daddy still loved her very much, but that we were going to live in different houses now. She'd nod as she understood, but then an hour later she'd ask the same questions again. The custody battle dragged on for what felt like forever. Both sides brought in character witnesses, people who could speak to what kind of parents we were. My wife's lawyer brought in her friends and family members, who talked about how she had always been the primary caregiver, the one who packed lunches, went to doctor's appointments, and organized birthday parties. My lawyer brought in my co-workers and friends, who testified that I was a dedicated father who worked hard to provide for my family. We submitted financial records, parenting evaluations, and schedules showing how we each spent time with the kids. My lawyer argued that despite my demanding job, I had always been present and loving, and that my wife's affair showed poor judgment and instability. Her lawyer argued that the kids needed consistency and routine, which she could provide since she had always been the one at home with them. The judge took months to review everything. When the judge finally made his ruling, I felt like the floor dropped out from under me. He granted my wife primary custody of all 3 kids. I got standard visitation, which meant every other weekend and one evening during the week. That was it. I was going from seeing my kids every single time I wanted to, seeing them a handful of days a month. I sat in that courtroom listening to the judge explain his reasoning, something about stability and the children's established routine, and I felt like I was being punished for something I didn't do. She was the one who cheated. Yet, she got the house, the one we'd bought together when Laurie was just a baby. She got primary custody of all 3 kids, which felt like a knife twisting in my chest every time I thought about it. She also got a chunk of my retirement savings, money I'd been putting away for years, thinking we'd grow old together. What did I get? My freedom, sure. But that freedom came with a visitation schedule that felt like I was being handed scraps from a table I used to sit at as the head of the family. Every other weekend and one evening a week. That was it. That was all the time I got with my own children. I wasn't going to waste a single second of that time. I threw myself into making my apartment a real home for them, not just some temporary stop between their real life at their mum's house. I planned something for every single visit. Movies, parks, game nights, cooking together, anything to make them feel like this was home too, not just Dad's apartment. But no matter how hard I tried to create a positive environment, the tension from their mother's house followed us wherever we went. Drop-offs and pickups became these awful, silent standoffs. My ex-wife blamed me for it. She'd send me angry texts accusing me of poisoning Laurie against her, of turning our daughter into a weapon to hurt her. I denied it every time because technically, I never sat Laurie down and told her to hate her mother. But if I'm being sincere, I didn't exactly discourage it either. Meanwhile, my ex-wife was falling apart in her own way. I didn't see it firsthand because I kept my promise to myself to maintain zero contact with her outside of what was necessary for the kids. But I heard things. Mutual friends would mention things to me when her name came up in conversation. I got the sense that she'd expected me to come crawling back after a few weeks, forgive the affair, and we'd patch things up for the sake of the family. When that didn't happen, she got bitter, resentful. She started dating again almost immediately, which I found out through the grapevine. Honestly, I didn't care. She could date whomever she wanted. We were done. Then, about 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Laurie mentioned that her mum had a new boyfriend. In her words, Mom's new boyfriend is creepy. I looked up from my own plate and asked her what she meant by creepy. She shrugged and said he stared at her weirdly and that he was mean to their mom. I wondered if he'd ever done anything to her or her siblings, and she said no, just that she didn't like him. I filed that information away but didn't think too much of it at the time. Laurie was protective of me, and I figured she'd hate anyone their mother dated because it meant accepting that our family was really over. I assumed she was exaggerating because she resented him, but over the next year, the stories from all 3 kids started to paint a darker picture. Dennis mentioned during one of our visits that his mother's boyfriend yelled a lot over minor things. In her innocent way, Brittany told me one night that the new guy made Mummy cry. She said she'd heard them fighting and that Mummy had locked herself in the bathroom. Laurie gave me the most detailed accounts. She described screaming matches that happened late at night, loud enough that she could hear them through her bedroom door. She said the new boyfriend had a temper, that he'd punch walls and throw things when he got angry. She told me she'd started locking her bedroom door at night because she didn't feel safe. That's when I started paying closer attention. I realized this wasn't just my kids being resentful, something was actually wrong. During my parenting time, I'd sit down with each of them individually and ask gentle questions about what was happening at their mum's house. I didn't want to sound like I was interrogating them or trying to get dirt on their mother, but I needed to know if they were safe. Laurie was the most willing to talk. She was 16 now, old enough to understand the situation and articulate what she was seeing. She told me how her mother's new man was controlling and jealous. He'd go through their mom's phone, accuse her of texting other men, and start fights over nothing. She said he drank heavily, especially on weekends, and that when he was drunk, he got mean. He'd call their mom names, belittle her, and pick fights that would escalate into shouting matches. Laurie said she felt unsafe when the new guy was drunk. She'd started keeping her phone nearby in case she needed to call someone. During one weekend visitation, Dennis showed me a bruise on his arm, which he explained came from the mother's lover. It was fading, but I could still see the distinct outline of fingers wrapped around his upper arm. My blood ran cold. I pulled over into a parking lot, took out my phone, and snapped photos of the bruise from multiple angles. I asked Dennis if his mother's lover had ever hurt him before, and he said no, but that he was scared it might happen again. I told Dennis I was going to handle it, that he didn't need to be afraid, and that I'd make sure he was safe. I didn't waste any time. The next morning, I called my attorney and explained everything the kids had told me. I sent him the photos of Dennis's bruise. My lawyer listened carefully and then told me we needed to file for an emergency custody modification. He said we'd argue that the environment at their mother's home was unsafe and that the kids needed to be removed immediately. But he also warned me that family court judges were highly reluctant to overturn custody arrangements. They didn't like to disrupt kids' lives unless there was clear, undeniable proof of danger. He said we'd need substantial evidence, not just the kids' word against their mothers. He told me to take the kids to a family therapist who could document their concerns in official clinical notes, and that I consider hiring a private investigator to observe the house and gather evidence of this behavior. I followed his advice to the letter. I took the kids to a family therapist, a kind woman who specialized in trauma and family dynamics. She met with all three kids individually and together, and she documented their concerns in her clinical notes. She told me privately that she was worried about the environment they were describing, and that she'd be willing to testify or submit a report if it came to that. I also hired a private investigator, a guy my attorney recommended. The investigator set up discreet surveillance on my ex-wife's house, watching for any signs of the behavior the kids had described. Over the course of the following year, the evidence piled up. The private investigator captured video footage of my ex-wife's lover stumbling drunk into the house late at night, barely able to walk straight. He recorded audio of shouting matches that were loud enough to hear from the street, with the lover's voice clearly audible, calling my ex-wife horrible names. The children's therapist submitted a detailed report outlining her concerns about the children's emotional well-being and the unsafe environment they were describing. Laurie, now 16, wrote a formal statement on her own. She typed it up on her laptop and gave it to me to pass along to my attorney. In it, she described the toxic environment at her mother's house, the fear she felt living with her mother's lover, and her apparent desire to live with me full-time. It was heartbreaking to read, but it was also robust evidence. Dennis and Brittany spoke to a court-appointed child psychologist. They said they felt safest with Daddy. 2 years after the divorce was finalized, my attorney filed for a complete custody modification. We submitted everything we'd gathered. My attorney told me we had a strong case, but that nothing was guaranteed. Family court was unpredictable, and judges had considerable discretion. All I could do was wait and hope that the evidence would speak for itself. The custody hearing was one of the most brutal experiences of my life. It took place over 2 days. My ex-wife showed up looking defeated. Her lover wasn't with her, which I found interesting. Her attorney immediately went on the offensive. She argued that the children's complaints were exaggerated, that kids often dramatize situations during divorce, and that my ex-wife's lover was simply a strict disciplinarian trying to bring structure to a chaotic household. She accused me of manipulating the children, of coaching them to say negative things about their mother so I could win custody. She painted me as a vindictive ex-husband who couldn't let go of the past. But the evidence was overwhelming. My attorney presented everything. The judge also spoke privately with each child in his chambers. I wasn't allowed in the room, but my attorney told me later that all 3 kids had expressed a clear, consistent preference to live with me. They'd told the judge they felt unsafe at their mother's house and that they wanted to be with their dad. My ex-wife took the stand on the second day. She looked small and broken sitting there. Her attorney asked her about her lover, and she admitted that their relationship was complex. She said they fought sometimes, but that she was trying to make it work. She insisted that her lover had never hurt the children, that the bruise on Dennis's arm was an accident, and that the kids were just upset about the divorce and taking it out on her lover. She cried on the stand, saying she loved her children and that she was doing her best. After 2 full days of testimony, the judge took a short recess to review everything. When he came back, he didn't waste time. He said he'd reviewed all the evidence spoken with the children, and considered both sides' arguments. He said it was clear to him that the environment at the mother's home was unstable and potentially dangerous, and that the children's safety and well-being had to be the top priority. He ruled in my favor. I was granted primary custody of all 3 children, effective immediately. My ex-wife would be allowed supervised visitation every other weekend until she could demonstrate that she'd ended her relationship with her lover and established a stable, safe, living environment. The judge said he'd revisit the arrangement in 6 months to see if unsupervised visitation could be restored. I felt a wave of relief and vindication wash over me. Across the courtroom, my ex-wife sobbed. Her attorney put an arm around her, but she was inconsolable. For just a moment, I felt bad for her. She'd lost everything: her marriage, her children's trust, and now custody. She'd ended up in a toxic relationship that had cost her the most important thing in her life. But that sympathy faded fast when I remembered all I had been in. The kids moved in with me full-time about 3 weeks after the judge made his ruling. I remember that first night, with all 3 of them under my roof permanently. I ordered pizza, we watched a movie together on the couch, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw my kids actually relax. There was no tension in the air, no walking on eggshells, no waiting for an argument to explode. It was just us, and it felt right. As for their mother, my ex-wife, things are complicated. After she lost custody, she hit rock bottom. She finally ended things with her lover, thank God. And from what I understand, she's been in therapy. I don't talk to her directly unless it's necessary, but I hear updates through the kids. She sees Laurie, Dennis, and Brittany every other weekend now, and a court-appointed monitor supervises those visits to ensure everything remains appropriate and safe. I've noticed slight changes in my ex-wife during drop-offs and pickups. She's trying, I can see that, but the damage she caused runs deep. The trust is gone. I'll be honest with you, I will never forgive her for what she did. I know that might sound harsh, and maybe some people think I should let it go for the sake of the kids, but I can't. The affair was one thing, a betrayal that shattered me, but what came after was worse. The way she fought dirty in the divorce, tried to paint me as a bad father, and put our children in danger by bringing her lover into their lives. All of that is unforgivable in my eyes. I don't wish her harm, and I genuinely hope she continues to work on herself and becomes a better person, but I will never forget what she put our kids and me through. That said, I've found peace. Looking back at everything, the discovery, the divorce, the custody battle, the years of fighting, I realize that the most brutal battles really are the ones worth fighting. There were so many moments when I wanted to give up, when the legal fees piled up, when the emotional exhaustion felt unbearable, when I wondered if I was doing the right thing. But every time I looked at my kids, I knew I had to keep going. So if you're listening to this and you're going through something similar, whether it's a divorce, a custody battle, or any situation where you're fighting to protect the people you love, don't give up. It's going to be brutal. It's going to test you in ways you never imagined. But if you keep pushing forward, if you stay focused on what really matters, you'll get through it. Your kids will remember who showed up for them, who fought for them, who made them feel safe. That's what counts. Thank you for listening. I hope it helps someone out there who needs to hear it.